And let's talk about, oh, let's get out of ClickUp. So, yeah, thank you. All right, quick add that too. And bring up Freeform. Oh, right. Well, we're not talking about that today. Line tracing and chickens. Chicken tracing?
Sounds pretty good.
It's like when you, instead of casting a line, you cast a chicken and see if the chicken hits something. Sorry, that got weird very quickly. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply violence against animals. I take it back. Okay, all right. Let's talk about mixing and let's talk about music, actually. Now, I know this seems like there are two different topics, and they are, but there are some approaches which makes them actually kind of organically easy to discuss at the same time. And I think that will make sense once we start to. But first, let's talk about mixing, right? Because we haven't really discussed mixing much in Unreal at all. And that's been by design. There's plenty of other things to think about. There's some sound design to go over. But now is a good time to start doing that because we're getting to projects which are going to become more and more complex. And already by the end of the cabin project, you probably were hoping that you had better ways of controlling levels of the different sounds. And besides, going through the individual audio actor. So let's talk about this. Now, the thing that we are not going to have in Unreal, and that's too bad, is a mixing board. Ooh, Allen and Heath is on sale. All right then, excellent. Actually, I kind of like Allen and Heath. They're fine. I was gonna do that, but let me close all this stuff first. Let's click up. Okay, whatever. So why don't we have? Well, technically there is a mixing board. Wow, I'm really not very good today. Okay, we'll just leave the illustrations alone. But while there is technically a mixing board, it's not going to be, something which you'll expect to be, like this. That's not a mixing board. But you know what I mean. That has faders, that has knobs, and any of that. So of course you can mix in Unreal, but it's not the way that traditionally you would expect it to be, where you have your outputs. We're gonna stay in stereo, some kind of large box in the middle with lots of sliders, and inputs which are, well, our inputs actually, they're not going to be that different, but that's not the way that it's laid out in Unreal, even though of course it works that way. But like for instance in Unity you actually have a mixer, which in fact you can have multiple mixers, which I really like. Here in Unreal, what we have is a hierarchy. So Unreal does not use quite the same tools that we're used to. Instead, what Unreal does is it gives you the ability to control the volume. Hello, please come in. Unreal gives you the ability to control the volume of your sounds, to be fair, actually in way too many ways. Like if you're trying to figure out how many places can you change the volume of an object or an audio actor in Unreal, there's a lot of places. You can do it on the wave asset, you can do it on the actual meta sound if it's a meta sound, you can do it on the detail instance in the map, you can do it on the classes that is assigned to it, etc., 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 and there's way more. Right, so unfortunately, I say unfortunately because it's good to have options, but Unreal sometimes is guilty of almost giving us too many options. Some of that stems from the fact that, software's been around for a while, and when it was totally rehauled after version 3, version 4 has been around for 15 years or something like that. So it's been a while, and version 4 and 5, they are extension of the same. So in Unreal, there was Unreal Tournament, which became Unreal 2 and 2.5, then it became 3, and then something happened there. They just kind of freaked out or something. Then they had this thing called UDK, which was sort of Unreal 4, but not Unreal 4. Then they released Unreal 4, and at that point, it changed a lot of things. And we're still living with a lot of that stuff now. So what we're going to use instead is a relatively new system called modulation. So it's actually a plugin, and I'll show you how to make it work, how to enable it in Unreal. So this is actually a relatively new system. And when we think of modulation as synthesist, we think of LFOs and filters, and that's not what this is for. I mean, technically modulation is just, altering a signal with another. That's modulation. So in that regard, it is actual modulation, but it's volume modulation for the most part. So, and I'm not saying amplitude modulation, because that's also a synthesis technique, but you know what I mean, just to be clear. All right, so actually what you do first to get things going is, when you go to your, right, so when you go to Unreal and you're looking through the different ways to work with the plugin. In fact, I'm just gonna go right there for now, make sure my volume. Okay, all right, so that's fine, it's still on, but I'm gonna turn that off. By the way, this option right there, and then make sure that there's audio, I just wanted to make sure. This option right there in Unreal 5.6 and above actually gives you the option to preview the audio in your map without pressing play, which is kind of cool. There's other ways of doing that in other game engines. For a while, that's a relatively new thing for us in Unreal. So that's actually a very useful element to have. So whenever you're trying to do a sound check or something, or you just want to check something real quick, you can pull that up, and that will help with that as well. Now, when we go to, let me make sure I've got a couple other things enabled here. Yes, okay. So when we go to work with this system, the first thing we need to do is kind of have an idea in our head of how the signal is being routed. So before we even get into the ins and outs of modulation, let's see where does your audio go when you press play here. I've got this moody soundtrack going on. Well, I mean, obviously it's coming out of my 1/8 inch, but like internally, where all is that audio being summed to? So there's a couple of ways that you can get to that. But the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to type in here submix. And when I type in submix, you'll see there's a whole bunch of new assets that come up. For now, we only care about the green ones. So the green ones, they are in fact buses. That's how we would call them. They're called submixes in Unreal, but they are essentially a bus. So just to be clear, and I'm going to try to keep the lingo clear, because otherwise it gets confusing real quick. Submix equals bus. So we can think of that as our little glossary of terms. Unreal mix glossary, close enough. So there is always going to be a master submix or a main submix somewhere in there. And your audio is always going to be routed to that. Now, if I, for instance, double click on any of these, you can see that it actually gives me this view here, which is a graph, obviously. Well, these represent buses and then their destination. So essentially, this right here is a bus, this is a bus, and this is a bus. There's an effects submix, there's a music submix, and there's a main submix going on right now. That structure can be changed, it's easy to, and we'll take a look at how that's set up by default, but that's going to be one type of asset that's going to be useful for us to be aware of. So the submix is going to be essentially, again, for us, our buses. And we can create all sorts of different structures. Like you can see, for instance, there's a submix for music that's got a bus for guitars, bass, and drums. And you can actually just right click on here, you can just add a new submix, or you can create an asset separately under audio mix and sound submix. Now you do actually have audio buses, right? So what gives? Well, that's actually for use within Metasounds, not within the mixing system. I'm telling you, this shit does get confusing at first, but then you settle into it because there's a lot of different architectures that are overlapping. So if you see that bus, that's for routing audio to from multiple audio sources to a single bus destination, as the bus does, but that's for Metasound. For the audio in your map, you want to use this submix system. And you're going to find a couple of other type of tutorials online on how to mix stuff, because you could mix an entire game without using submixes, and well, submix would be harder, but without using modulation, because relatively new, but I do want to use modulation, and I think it makes sense why to in a minute. So right now in this, okay, no, thank you. So right now in this map, we do have 3 loops of music. There's actually here, that's just my ambience, sort of industrial hum. It's a little loud, so I'm going to take it down. So there's guitar, bass, and I've put some triggers on these objects. That's going to duck the mix, unduck it. That's going to give me just the guitars. That's the track.
It's just some guy in like a sandbox and
It makes the sandbox feel a little bit more dramatic.
just
So there's obviously, based on where I am right now, we'll look at other ways of controlling it, but based on where I am, you can say the mix is changing. Now, I'm also mentioning that, well, I mentioned earlier that, when it comes to talking about mixing, sometimes it's easy to really lead into music, and in this case, I'm talking about adaptive music and adaptive mixing. So let me, sure, without an E, that's fine. Let's do it German style. You don't want to have to change my So what do I mean by it? Well, you could see how essentially what I was doing by walking around was changing not just the mix, but muting and unmuting instruments. And it turns out that when you're doing music for games, that's not the only technique, but it's one of the main 2 techniques that we use to create our soundtrack and make them adaptive, make them adapt to the action. So essentially, once you understand how to mix, you kind of understand how to do some adaptive music a little bit as well. And like think of it as maybe more like classic, 70s, 80s, like dub reggae mix. For those of you who are into that, you should be if you're not. Underrated, those Jamaicans, because they kind of invented electronic music for pop. They kind of the first people to be like, the studio is actually an instrument. All right. Well, we were just not thinking that way. So, anyway, when Jimmy Cliff passed, I was like, oh, come on. All right. Okay. Now, so if we actually understand how to change our mix dynamically, well, we actually understand one of the main techniques for doing adaptive music, which is going to be, a vertical, it's not actually as vertical reorchestration. We'll talk a bit more about music specifically, but you can see that they actually are going to be very, very easily related, and you can start doing it once you understand this process. I say vertical reorchestration, which is a fancy way of saying turning on and muting stems, drums, bass, guitar, whatever. And games that you've played use these techniques like massively. Some games are built around that, less and less, but like a lot of the Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2, it's mostly this. In fact, all the music for Red Dead Redemption 1, I don't know about 2, was written in A minor at 130 BPM. So that means that they're all at the same tempo. 130 is good because you can do halftime. So you can go. Hello, hello, please come in. And A minor means that whatever you wrote for one piece will work for another. So if you have a guitar part, and you're thinking like, this scene could use something else, you could actually maybe take that guitar part and add it to this scene. You're like, yeah, actually it kind of works, right? So, and that's what this vertical reorchestration technique is. So, and that's kind of what I'm using in this map right now. All right, so we have 4 elements right now. We have bass, drum, guitar, and like a drone kind of hum. So, and there are triggers. It's a bit easier to do from there. So the volume itself, well, the objects in the map are meta sounds, right? So somewhere, there they are. There's a meta sound for bass, drums, and guitar. I put them anywhere in the map because they're just 2D, so it doesn't really matter. They don't even have to be there. We could hide them. That's something that we can now do in Unreal 5.6, which I'm very grateful for easily. Okay, so we can open any of these, and you'll see that there's really very little to it. It is a meta sound, and that's all it is. Right? Oh, I don't need this because it's gonna loop, obviously, so I'm gonna get rid of that. So there's just a wave player with a stem. And the stem themselves, the audio data is right there. There's a bunch of stuff going on there. Like the bass stem is right there, guitar and so forth. Right, so why is there a CR78 loop? I guess because it's cool. All right. Cool drum machine though. So, all right, so we have these 3 stems, and there's just this other thing here called test. I'm going to rename it because test doesn't really do anything for us. So I could have just done F2, but whatever. We'll call it ambience. So the way that we're going to control the volume for these then is going to be a little bit different from what we've done. So far, the way that we've controlled volume, and it was static once we left it, except for the fact that if you move closer or farther as a 2D or 3D object would, was that we would usually simply do it by changing the volume multiplier here. That's it. Now we're going to leave this as is. And you can see there's not that much else going on as far as the details go for this. So this is not where we're going to set that up. What we're going to do is use this. So let's just say that we have guitar, that's a bass, and it works. It's a 6-string bass. Yeah. And we have drum. No S at drum, by the way. That's weird. Okay. If you type in an S, I guess you get a drumstick. Yeah. All right. Okay. Whatever. Okay. So we have in our track we have plus the ambience, but we have guitar, bass, and drum. So what we're going to do to control the volume of each of these instruments is going to be using this modulation system. And the modulation system is going to have 2 main components to it. So you're going to have an asset type. So this represents just the icon for the asset in Unreal. Called a let me just actually show you right here on the modulation. It's a little bit easier. A control bus and control bus mixes. So the control bus are these pink here, or indigo, I guess. I don't know, they're fuchsia, whatever. This shade, and this. Fuck colors. I mean, I like colors. I just there's 2 variations of pinkish things. Wow. It's very articulate. Anyway, So we have these control buses and these control bus mixes. What do they do? Well, actually, you can sort of tell by the icons. It's pretty clear, right? No, I'm joking. Well, you see a volume slider here, a slider, which we can assume is volume, but can be other things, controlling the the amplitude of this wave. So that's actually going to be where we are going to be making that connection. The connection between what and what? Well, the connection between a piece of music, an audio actor, and the way to control its volume through Blueprint. Now, so we're going to have these control buses, and let's get a better color for this, like, sure. Or this one? Yeah, I guess the light, sure, okay. So these control buses, and we're going to create one for each instrument. You know, guitar, bass, and drums. All right, so, and what that's going to be doing for us is volume. Except that, as we'll see, really all that's really happening there is we're actually just making it possible for Unreal via Blueprint to control the volume of these instruments. It's still actually not how we're gonna turn something up and down. We need these assets, and they need to be assigned, as we'll see. They can be assigned to things other than volume, by the way, but to actually say, okay, now I want the guitars to come up or the bass to come down or whatever, then we need to create this other type of asset called a control bus mix. Following me? Just, it makes more sense, I promise. So CBM for control bus mix, and the control bus mix is actually where we're gonna set the volume of one or multiple instruments. Volume sets for, I don't know, maybe we're just changing the guitar, but we could do all of it. So there are two elements, right? Two main elements for now. These control buses and these control bus mixes. And for the most part, control buses by default will control the volume, but they can be assigned to other things. They can be assigned to low pass filtering or whatever. They can control other things. But it's almost more like a modular synthesizer where you like literally have to put in a patch cord between two units to actually make something happen, right? So it's a little bit more the way that it's set up in here. All right, so let's take a look at this modulation folder. So first of all, I right click here to get to the audio tab, modulation, and then, you know, I went to create a control bus. Let's do a dummy control bus. I like to start mine with underscore CB, so I know it's a control bus, and then we're gonna call it dummy bus. All right, what do we get in a control bus? Well, not very much, right? You get a parameter, which by default is gonna be volume. Now, it should do a little bit more than that. Sometimes what you can do is, if you don't see many options there when you select an asset, click on plugin content. So click on the little cogwheel, plugin content, and we'll show you actually what other options you have. So we can control pitch, pan, sample rate, and then the time of day. And true fact, if you change that, the actual time of day on your clock will change. It's true. No, of course, I'm just fucking with you guys. No. It's just as a simple, like, commonly used parameter in like day-night cycles, so you can change your music or other thing with the time of day. Now, but of course, it's going to be mostly about volume and panning, and by default, it's going to be assigned to volume, so we don't have to do much to that. Now, there's not that much else to it, except for, and we might not get to that today, but you'll notice there is something that says address. Well, the address is going to be usually the name of it, but sometimes it will change. It's a way that for us, we can sometimes access this from Blueprint in more sophisticated ways. So we probably won't come back to that today, but we will, because that's actually a cool feature. Other than that, there's not much else. You see, you have this option for creating generators, but at that point, it's for more modulation, and these modulations could be, well, that's all we get for now in this case. Could be also the different things. Let's actually just add a modulation parameter. Let me trash me. We go, and you can see here that we have a couple other things like envelopes, envelope followers, and LFOs. So you could actually have this modulate the amplitude of something like consistently. If you wanted to, do a tremolo effect on something, you could do that. But you probably wouldn't. You would render that as an asset with that already baked into it, because that's a little bit wasteful to do this way. But you can. We're not going to worry about any of that because that's not usually the main thing. So I'm going to leave this as it is, and in fact, we're not going to use it because I already created a bunch of others. So I'm going to delete that just so it doesn't get in the way of a bunch of other stuff. So I have one for bass, for guitar, drums, and a bunch of other stuff that were added. Right. Now, what do we do with these? Well, think of that as the cable in your modular synthesizer, and then it depends on where you plug it in. Right. And you can actually plug it in a number of places. Right now, let's take a look at our meta sounds. Let's go to the bass meta sound. And you'll see that there's something a little bit unusual compared to what we've looked at so far, which is this section right here. So if you click on source and then details, usually there's nothing there. Well, I'll show you what there is there by default. We change that. You can see that here there is something that says control bus. So this meta sound for bass has that control bus assigned to it. And that's very useful because that's how we're going to control the volume of our bass. So if you go through a regular quote-unquote meta sound, let's create a new meta sound just so you can compare. I can show you how to add a control bus. Meta sound. Oh my god, not running at full speed today. Trash, sure. So when you create a meta sound, normally once you're in the source option here, there's not much going on there. But you see there is a modulation option. And by default, it just says inherit, inherit, inherit. There's volume, pitch, high pass, and low pass. It's called routing, but really it's just a way to control all of these parameters. Since we want to control the volume, if we say inherit, it just means that whatever parent, child this thing has, it will take this volume. There's no parent, it will take whatever volume you set it at in the details tab. Oh, that's it. So we're going to actually go to union. And what union does is it actually allows you to modulate this volume with something else. That's where you can plug in our control buses. So right now it says volume. I'm going to click on modulate, and it gives me an option to add an array of modulators. But we're only going to use one. Forgive me for yawning. Like I said, it's been a very, very long week. And I'm going to here select any of the ones I want, like, say CBA guitar. That's now assigned the control bus for guitar to this. So when that changes volume, so will this meta sound, which I'm going to get rid of anyway because it's a dummy one. But that's how you would do it. Now, important things to notice. First, the modulation tab, we switch from inherit to union. We could also do override if we wanted to. So union means that it's actually going to consider the value that it currently has, and then it's going to essentially multiply by whatever comes its way, as in the modulation. If you wanted to do override, it would skip the multiplication side of it. It would just say, okay, that's your current value now. That's it. So the difference for us is not really, it's, in this case, it will make zero difference for us, but that's why you have a difference between the two. Now union, again, we need to click on modulate, and that's going to give you the option to add volume modulators, which we have done now. Okay, so let me get rid of this. Thank you. So all of these have a volume modulator here. I got fancy on the guitar. I forgot I did that. All right, cool. Okay, so, but these modulators, these control buses, they're half of the equation. Sorry. The other part of the equation is this control bus mixes. So control bus mix is actually where you're gonna tell Unreal, now you raise that volume up, you raise that volume, you lower that volume, you do whatever it is. So once you have this connection, you need to create a control bus mix. What is a control bus mix, you ask? Well, let's create one. Audio, modulation, control bus mix. Here it is. I'm going to call this one dummy CBM underscore dummy. Alright, well, there's not much going on in the control bus mix, but there's actually some interesting things going on here. We'll talk about some of these today. Now, if you look at this, there's really not many things you can actually add to this unless you click on the little plus button right there. Let's do that. It gets you a mixed stage option, and your mixed stage option allows you to select your CBs, your control buses. So bass, I'm going to create another one. We're going to do drums. Yeah, I don't need a drum bit. Okay, and we'll do the guitar one. So I don't have to add all three of them, but you know, kind of feeling it. So I am. And then, wait, I did bass, drum, oh yeah, guitar. Now, for each of these, you have a couple options: value, attack, and release. It sounds like a compressor. Well, technically, I suppose the volume control is a compressor, but it's not. Right? So what it does here is it gives you the option to set the volume either in dB on this side, down to -60, which is your normalized 0 to 1 version here. And then here it's the attack and release time, so how long it takes for the sound to get to that volume, and then when it returns back to another volume, or how long does it take to let go. If I press play right now, and if I change this, the bass is still going strong. That's because this mix, or control bus mix, but you can see it's electrical, has not been activated. Once I activate it, it's actually going to start to change the volume based on what I enter here. If I deactivate, it goes back to where it was. So that's now a little bit more interesting. And that's how we're able to control duck, drums, or guitars only. Yeah, it sounds a lot cooler, like, you know, when you're running with that music on it, even in a sandbox, for sure. It's like one of those, like, you know, like synthwave retro video from like 1984. Anyway, so how do we then apply that using Blueprint? Well, that's actually the easy bit. In this case, bless you. In this case, I'm just using triggers again, and it's all done on the level Blueprint. And all I did is this. For each trigger, there is a begin and end overlap. Excuse me. And then when you walk through a trigger, it's going to activate a control bus mix. And there's multiple control bus mixes. So you can see that this one says full. So if I go to that asset, CBM full, if I can find it. Did I move it somewhere else without realizing? Probably did. That's okay. Let's find it. Let's do a full mix search. Yeah, where are you? Doesn't matter. We'll leave it later. Here we go. Okay, so in this one you can see that I've brought everything down by about 10 dB. That's why when you walk onto the little wedge, the mix ducks more by 10 dB because of that. Right, so for each one of these different mix stages, there's a different control bus mix. All right, so there's a control bus mix for, you know, guitar only. There's one for, you know, no drums, etc., etc., etc. CBM, no bird. This one's in all cap because I don't know why. Okay, maybe there's no birds in this map, so it doesn't make sense. But so think of these as, well, actually, not sure it's gonna speak to you because unless you worked in an old school, you know, large format mixing console, we don't use snapshots anymore. But back in the day of these large format mixing consoles, you would change the mix between, say, verses and chorus by doing the snapshot automation. So you would start from, you know, whatever the mix position, and during the chorus you wanted to bring up the drums by 4 dB. Well, you would get to the chorus with your reel-to-reel with time code attached to it. The console would read that and say, okay, make a break here, and at that point when you get to this time code, I want you to go up 4 dB on that slider. And that would be a snapshot. And then you would do that for every, I want more reverb on the vocals. So it was called snapshot automation. Obviously with a DAW we don't need that anymore. It's much better and much easier to just do it, you know, to draw all these shapes. But in video games we still use this snapshot automation quite a bit. In fact, in Unity they're called snapshots because, well, essentially they are. But Unity does actually offer a mixer, which is nice, which is not the case for Unreal. Again, there is a mixer in there, but it's given to you in bits. It's like they put the mixer apart and they're saying like, well, just connect the parts together. It's not that hard. So the way that we call a control bus mix is easy. There is, as you can see here, an activate control bus mix node in Blueprint. And there's also a deactivate control bus mix node, as you can tell. And that's important. You need to deactivate that your current control bus mix before you should activate another one. Otherwise things sometimes get a little wonky. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. They get a little funny. So always best to deactivate a control mix. You should only have really one active at a time, at least for things which control the same instruments. You can have multiple control bus mixes active as long as they don't overlap. So if you have one control bus mix that controls the music, there should only be one for the music. But if you have one for music and one for sound effects, that's totally okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So you can see here we have these, and that works pretty well. Now, I was saying earlier that there's a lot of ways to change the volume in Unreal. And right now what we're doing, right, is we're affecting the volume of all the instruments individually. And that's okay, except that sometimes, well, it's a bit of a hassle. What if I just want to mute the music? Do I have to like go through each one of these and say, turn this down, turn that down? Like, it would be a lot easier if I had music down, right? And that's the next step. But of course, for me to be able to do that and to just change one thing that changes multiple things, I need a submix. Right, so let's go back to where we were talking a little bit toward the beginning of the class. So we have this modulation subsystem, right? And this modulation system is made of two major elements: these control buses and these control bus mixes. That's really what you are working with. Now, before, you would actually use sound classes to do this. Now, you can still use sound classes to do this, which is why it gets confusing. Because if I look at a sound class, right, I'm gonna, oh, right, clear search. There we go, sound class. My sound class does actually have a volume control. And remember that a sound class can be assigned to more than one audio actor. So if I assign a sound class to all my sound effects and I bring the volume down the sound class, all my sound effects come down. So you might be tempted to say, isn't that a bus? It's not, because it's not routing the audio to a single destination. It's controlling the volume of multiple objects, but these objects are still going to their individual path. So it'll be more like grouping on a mixer. If you're in Pro Tools, this is not an aux input, this is a group. Like you move one slider and the entire group goes up and down. That's what this does. We're not going to use those very much. In fact, I recommend that you don't really use control classes for mixing unless there's a very good reason to. Because even for your own sake, then it gets really confusing. If you start to use classes and modulation mixes and submixes, then it's going to be impossible to keep track of, well, how did I turn the freaking volume down of this thing? And you're not going to like it. Having to, like, you know, look at you might think you'll remember, but if you're like me, 10 minutes after that you thought you'll remember it, you already have forgotten. Maybe your retention period is longer than mine, but still, you'll forget. So, yes, we could use sound classes, and in some cases, it might be okay. But, again, remember that a sound class, it's applying a scalar to a bunch of audio actors, but it's not taking the audio output of these actors and routing it to the same place. And so therefore, this is not a bus. If you wanted to do that, to take, hey, this is all of my music, and I want all of these audio actors to be routed to this bus, we have to go back to the earlier concept that I brought up, which is these submixes. So submix in Unreal is in fact a bus. And you can control your submixes from a number of places. Now, I will say this. Even though classes versus control buses can be confusing, I shouldn't say even though, it can get even more confusing, let me put it this way. Because if you're looking at this sound class, you'll notice that it does have a modulation option here. And it does have the option to modulate. So I can actually plug in a control bus in a sound class. That will also work. That's why I urge you to not use sound classes right now, because again, you will, if you don't have a method, like for, you know, I'm gonna use modulation on submixes as opposed to modulation, it's gonna be hard to keep track of where you make your changes. So forget about it. All right, let's go back to this. So now we have these submixes in Unreal. And the submixes, they're different types of audio asset. In fact, I've got a mix folder here where you can see there is a bunch of submix. It might even be more submixes somewhere else, actually, if I type in submix. Yeah, well, so the submix represents the routing of these buses into one another. So the main submix here is taking an input from a master music mix and an effects submix. The naming isn't very consistent, but we get the idea. There's always going to be a default master submix in your session. I got rid of it in this case. There's always going to be one, and that's by default where all of your audio returns to, this thing called master submix. So if you open a map in Unreal, unless they removed it, you'll find something that says master submix. Now, we are going to create a submix by just going again audio mix, sound submix. And again, there is an audio bus option here, but that is for use with meta sounds, in which case, yes, it is a regular bus, but that's for meta sound only, not for mixing your game. So here, I'm gonna go to a sound submix, call this one dummy submix. Did I just delete? Oh, I just did. I wasn't paying attention. Oh, there it is. And then when you double click on it, you just get this. So by default, as we're gonna see, this is gonna be routed to whatever the default master submix is. Now, I can create new sound submixes by just right clicking in there. Call this one do, because there's do and do. And I can arrange them that way and do, and let's call this one day. And what I've done here is I've created a mix called do and day are going to be routed through do. Okay, that makes zero sense, so we're going to get rid of all of that. But you get the idea. Now, when I created these submixes here, Unreal actually created assets. So there's day, do, and do right here. So it actually does create individual ones, individual assets when you do that. Yes, let's delete that, please. All right, so where do we assign these submixes to an audio source or audio actor of some kind? Well, let's check out a couple other things. So right now, let's go back to our meta sounds. Clear the search. And then we have bass, stems, and guitar, right? So these are the main, and forgive me for yawning. And then the effects here. All right, so we don't need that. One shot, goodbye. All right, so let's go to the bass meta sound. So in the bass meta sound, we have here, as you can tell, volume, pitch, set, etc., etc. And if I keep going further and further down in the details tab, so I'm under the source tab, you will see, eventually you will see something that says submix. And right now it says enable bass submix, which is fine. We're going to leave it at that. It also says enable submix sans. Well, they're buses, right? So how do you go from one bus to another? While using sans, you can do that. So, but we're going to keep it simple. I'm going to go to my bass submix here. It says none. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to click on the master music submix. Right there. Let's do that for the other in stems as well. Submix right there. I'm gonna go to master music, and then the last one, guitar. Here. Alright, so if I press play now, not much should be different, but I'm gonna go to my submix folders here, go to my master music. So right now I've routed everything to this. As you can tell, I can now control the entire music mix from this one fader. Well, it's not really a fader, but just one sort of a fader. So now I've got the ability to route all of this stuff through here. So can I then use a control bus and control bus mix assets to control the volume of a submix? Yes. Yes, you can. Yeah, I know. We're gonna revisit this because it's a lot of confusing shit. It is. It's just the way it is. Takes a minute to wrap your head around it. But so right now, what we do know is all of our music is returning it to this destination. And what if I want to be able to change the overall volume of the entire music, just using a blueprint node? Well, my submix level is right here. I do have an option for modulating. And then I'm going to add another entry here. And guess what I have access to here? It gives me, again, my control buses. So I don't have a control bus for everything. I'm not sure why I have one for voice, because there's no voice in it. But, let's create another control bus. And we'll call this one control bus music volume. So audio modulation, control bus, CB underscore music volume. And I just assign volume to it. Again, we can control other things, and then I'm going to add that to our mix. Master music, right here where it says volume, output volume, modulate, yes. CB music volume in all caps, why not? Great. So now I have a connection to control the music volume, but I don't have yet the actual control. So I'm going to create a control bus mix. I gotta say, it's kind of exhausting saying all those words over and over again. Control bus mix, control bus mix. It's like, could just be that I'm very tired. But still. Okay, so audio, modulation, control bus mix, CBM, music, CBM, music, CBM music. Double click on that. We're going to add one stage for volume control. CBM music volume. Press play. Instead of creating a meta sound blueprint for it, I'm just going to have a blueprint for it. I'm going to click on activate mix. And I'm going to change the volume here. Let's revisit that one more time. That would be helpful. So, in Unreal, again, we don't really have access to a mixing board. I say in Unreal because, again, in Unity, they give you nice little sliders and everything. It's one of the few things where Unity has the edge.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because you're essentially doing a lot of different functions with the control mixes and the mixing boards and whatnot. Isn't that like, I guess, kind of like how in DAWs with like that arrangement, you kind of see all the things like routed. Is there something like that in Unreal or not really?
There's no really sort of summary of everything. Now the closest you can visualize is, you can do things like this, but it's not exactly what you're looking for. So for any asset that you have, you can right click, right? You can say reference viewer. And it will show you things which are talking to this object. So the guitar meta sound that's connected to it, it shows up in these control bus mixes objects. And this is controlling the volume as a parameter. So it does show you that, and that can be useful, don't get me wrong, right? Because at least you can see like, oh, why am I turning the volume down of this thing whenever I'm changing the guitar or whatever, like, so you can do that, right? But it's more for individual assets that you can see where it's like, there's no like master plan. Too bad. So
Does that exist in Unity or not really either?
well, in Unity, because you actually have a mixer, you're looking at groups. Like just for contrast, I'll show you before the class is over, because it's an interesting comparison, and it's kind of strange to me that to this day Unreal hasn't quite done that, because it seems like a lot of people would really much prefer that. And they've given us some weird, some cool but kind of weird audio features, but not that. Like you have max, sort of, not quite max, but you have a lot of power, but you don't have a simple mixer, which I'm sure is a very good reason that like it's whatever, like rebuilding that around architecture might make 0 sense and would take 3 years, and I don't know, but it's kind of strange to have that. But yes, this is still very useful, so it's worth mentioning. That you can, especially when you start to get into these, you can find any asset, but that's also true for this, and then just kind of right click on it and again go to the reference viewer. Like nobody's using test CBM. That's so sad. Yeah, look how lonely you are. That's the world. It's empty for you. Okay. All right, let's get rid of it. It makes me sad. Okay, all right, so in Unreal, instead of having mixers with buses and so forth, we have 2 aspects that we're gonna work with. The main thing to control the mix is gonna be this modulation subsystem. So the modulation subsystem is made up of 2 main elements. The first one is the control bus, and the control bus, as the name implies, well, gives you control to something. Not really a bus, and for the most part, it'll be volume, but can be other things like panning, pitch, whatever. And then the other aspect of the modulation is going to be these control bus mixes. And the control bus mixes is where you actually set the value of these control buses that you plug into volume. Right, so these are the elements. So for every audio source that you wish to, or audio actor, that you wish to control the volume of using Blueprint or code, you need to create a modulation control bus and assign it to whatever you want to control. Volume, for the most part, but not only. Once you have created these control bus, to actually then change the volume, you need to create at least one control bus mix asset. A control bus mix asset is essentially a snapshot of your mix at any given time. And it can control one thing, or it can control everything. It's up to you. Now, these are essentially ways for you to have access to essentially just a knob for volume. If you want to take your synthesizers and run them through a same stereo bus, so you can then control and process them the same way, that's not what modulation does. For that, we go to a submix system. And a submix system is in fact a bus, as far as we are concerned as audio people or music tech people. Meaning that this actually allows you to take all if you want to, but any number of audio actors and having delivered to a single destination. And you can also work with modulation within your submixes, right? So you do not need to actually route stuff through a submix to control the volume of it, but if you want to, you can, and you'll save time, which is what we did in this case. right? So all of our instruments are running through the control bus mix called Music Master, I think. Somewhere in there, there's one. I can't read right now. I can barely process. But anyway, it's in there. And we can now control the volume of it easily. So that means that when you're working with these assets, you need to assign them, of course. So both of these modulation assets and the submix, they need to be assigned to these objects. And usually that can be done at a number of places, but we'll be working with Metasound, even if they're very simple Metasound. So I recommend that you do it at the Metasound level. For the bass, for instance, we have two things going on in here under source. We have the volume modulator, which control the volume just of the Metasound itself, nothing else. But we've also run it through a submix called Master Music right there. And that submix is controlled by this music CB control bus music volume. So I can access the bass individually by accessing this control bus called just bass, CB underscore bass. If I change that, I will only change the volume of the bass. But if I want to change the volume of all the instruments at once, I can do that by accessing the submix for music and changing the volume of the control bus music volume. And that will change everything because all my other instruments are routed there. One last thing. I brought up that you could actually see that in your, here, let me go back to my Metasound here. Maybe not for the bass, let's do it for the guitar. There is an option for send. So, okay, so I've got my guitar here. I guess I'm doing pitch shift to it. Or not, okay, whatever, screw it. All right, and in here, if we scroll down again, select source, scroll down, you'll see that we have our modulation. Yeah, well, we have our volume modulator here for CB guitar. That's just to control the volume of the guitar and nothing else. And then I have the submix, which has been assigned to Master Music. So now I'm taking the audio output from my guitar and it's being routed through the Master Mix. But you'll notice there's something that says submix send. Well, what if I want to add effects to this? We haven't really discussed effects a lot in the context of Unreal except for reverb, but really when we wanted reverb so far, what we've done is we put a audio volume, and added reverb to that audio volume. And that's fine, except there's limitations around that. The limitation is that this only works within a specific geographical area in the map. So if I want the reverb to actually go across multiple parts of the map, I either have to create multiple audio volume with the same sounds or one large one, and it gets complicated. It's very useful for certain things. If you're in a large cathedral, well, great, just put a control like a audio volume there. But if you just want, a bunch of reverb throughout different rooms, different parts, and you want the reverb to be somewhat consistent, then volumes are not really the way to go, not audio volumes. Then what we can do is use the other method, which is to actually use it as a regular aux send like you would in a mixer. And this is what you can do here. So let's do an example of that. So right now, you can see here, I've got my submix send. It says one element. I'm gonna actually go to my sound submix here and see what I have. Well, I do have something that says, no, that's for master reverb submix default, master submix default is the basic one. Let's do SM big reverb, submix big reverb. I guess this one. Oh, I had it and then I lost it. Here we go. All right, so let's click on that and see what's there. So this is another submix, this one called Big Reverb. And you notice that there is something that says submix effects change. So there's not much going on here. We just see the submix. It's called SM Big Reverb. And there is this thing right at the top that says, sound submix. You open that, and you're gonna have this thing that says submix effects chain. Here it says one element because I clicked on the little plus button there, and it gives me this option here, master reverb preset. Let's actually delete this and create one together. So I'm gonna click on plus, and it says again submix effects chain. So now we're actually gonna talk about adding processors as plugins. So I'm going to click on this none option here, and you can see I've got these number of options. It says submix effect preset. Oh, another option is resonance audio reverb settings. So resonance audio was, I think, Google's AI API for audio processing, and they kind of gave up development on that. Like a lot of these companies did. Like Meta had one, Google had one, Microsoft had one, a bunch of others. And the development has kind of fallen off a little bit. But a plugin is essentially called a submix effects preset. That's confusing. Now by plugin, I mean what you and I would think of a plugin, like, oh, I need reverb on this thing, so let me pull up a plugin and put it on this insert. That's what I mean by that. Here they're called effects, effects presets. So there's one that says, compression flex. Let's go to flex verb. All right, let's see what happens when I double click on that. Oh, well, I got a pre-delay, a decay time, room dampening, and complexity of the room number of sides. So not a very exciting reverb, but let's talk about it. Let's see what happens. So now let me go back to the guitar, and I did send it to this send here. Now I'm using a manual send right now, but I could use modulation for it, but I'm not going to do that just yet. Reverb. No reverb. So this is then acting as an aux send for this. Now that reverb kind of blows. I mean, not kinda, it's terrible. There's a couple of other options. You can also download specific reverb plugins separately, independently from that. Some of them are free, some of them aren't. But let's go back to, flex verb, I don't like you. Let's go to resonance, let's go to SB effects verb. No, what am I doing? Right here. That's the classic reverb, well, classic, that's the one that you've worked in inside of the audio volumes. When you add a reverb zone, that's what you get. And here you have a little bit more control. You have early reflections, etc., etc. I mean, the same control that we've had before. Wet level and dry level. I'm going to bring the dry level down to 0 because I don't really want it. Anything beyond that. And let's make the reverb time 11 seconds. Sure, let's be subtle. Slightly better reverb. So now I can add effects that way to my mixes. A couple of things about this. Now, you'll notice that when I look at my submix send option, nope. Oh, you won't notice. Oh, do I have two versions of Unreal running? Oh, no, I didn't. Okay. So, no. I think it's what I didn't save any of that, so whatever. Yes, you'll notice that there's an option for pre or post spatialization, right? Because essentially, like again, if you've done anything if you've done anything with something that is remotely like Atmos, you know that spatialization, so distance becomes a parameter in the overall mix. It's not just volume, it's also the distance from the listener that actually affects the overall volume. This is very similar. Obviously, distance is a factor here because it's a 3D environment. So if I go back to my guitar, look at my submix send, there's nothing there now right now, but that's okay. You'll see that I've got a couple of options. Let's open them up so it's easier to see. So send stage, where do I want to send it? You can see there's post distance attenuation or pre-distance attenuation. By default, it's post. That means that the sound will first be attenuated because of distance and then sent to the reverb. If you want it to be the other way around, you have to specify that. So it'd be like pre and post fader sort of. And it breaks down as a metaphor quickly, but it's sort of the basic idea. Level control. Now I have linear, manual. So manual is giving me the option to essentially just send my level manually here. Or custom curve, where if I wanted to, I can also use a minimum and maximum distance for the send. So if I'm farther away from the sound, I can send more. If I'm closer to the sound, I can send less. I can draw a curve to do that, which is pretty cool if you want to do that as well. And there's a linear option as well, where you just send minimum level, minimum distance, maximum distance. So in this case, you get more reverb, of course, as you're getting farther away, and less as you get closer. That would be the default behavior. But that's, of course, would apply only for things which are going to be 3D. If it's a 2D sound, then it doesn't really matter. And let's leave it at that for today, because that's a lot of stuff. But questions? Yeah. Yeah.
You get a little lost in some of the sauce, but overall, I think I'm understanding that there's components that can control different parts of the mix.
It is, and again, keep this in mind. Like, to control the actual volume, right? What's gonna set the volume is gonna be these control bus mixes. That's what sets the volume. So you load a control bus mix, it's gonna change the volume to whatever you specified, and the control bus mix looks like that as an asset when you open it. It's going to have mix stages for however elements you want to control. Here, I can control the stems for the guitar, the bass, and the drums separately. And then in these control bus mixes, in each slot, you plug in a control bus. That control bus was assigned to the meta sound or the sound or the audio actor that you want to control the volume of. So control bus mixes set your volume. In fact, they're kind of snapshots. Control buses, that's actually the knob that you turn up and down to turn the volume up. You just have to tell it where the knob goes. Or maybe put a volume knob on the guitar. The routing of these audio actors, however, the actual destination where the audio goes, is not done using this particular method. These assets do not control the routing. That's submixes. And submixes are separate assets. And these submixes here are essentially what we think of as buses. So when you want to have a bus for all your sound effects, you're going to create a sound effects submix. Yeah, good. We can finish that sentence. As you control your sound effects submix, what you end up doing is creating essentially a diagram of your mix. Right, so if you do a very simple, like we have now, like we have guitar, bass, and drums, but they all routed to a music submix, then your submix diagram is very simple. And it grows in complexity as you add more submixes, of course. When you create a submix, you do have to tell it where it's going to go. By default, there's always an active default submix in your project unless you disable it. So submixes for routing, submix sends for routing to effects, as in aux inputs, control buses to plug into volume, to plug into pitch, whatever, control bus mixes to set the value of these control buses. I think if I keep repeating it now, it's not going to make any more sense, but that's the basic idea. Other questions? Let's see. What else? Did I forget anything? We covered this. Anything here? I'm just trying to think if there's something else I've missed. I think no, world setting. We don't really need to worry too much about that. Is there anything in the world setting I wanted to go over? I don't think so, but you never know. Sometimes my memory gets toggled, whatever. Can't speak. Oh, yeah. Here's one. So I'm in my world setting, right? And you'll notice that there's a couple of audio options. One for a default reverb setting. Now, these usually are populated. I think I unpopulated them, but there's a thing that says default bass sound mix. So there's a default reverb plugin that you effect and plugin that you can select. But there's also a default bass sound mix, which is going to be where the mix is, what your sound gets routed to before they hit the headphone jack. Right now it says nothing here because I'm just using the my default sound mix, but you can select your options here for the bass sound mix. What else? I think that's it. World setting, let's jargon, load layout, viewport. Oh, I'm sorry. Project settings. I know I forgot one thing. that one would be a head scratcher. You need to go into your project settings first. You're gonna go into your audio. This is where you see all the default routing. Master submix default, master reverb default, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff is good. So again, we're going to look at this for the entire project, not for the world. So that's going to override that. We have a default sound classes. Now, again, remember, like I'm saying, don't use sound classes for volume because otherwise it's going to get confusing even for you. Even though you can do it, don't. But if we go to plugins, you need to make sure that your audio modulation plugin is enabled. So if it's not, you'll know it because when you go to your content drawer and you click on audio, you won't see an option for modulation. If you don't see an option for modulation, no worries. Go to your project settings, or you could go straight to plugin, but then go to plugin and see what's enabled. You can also access the plugin directly from, well, plugins. And then under here, audio, make sure that modulation is enabled. If it's not enabled, it's gonna close the session, reopen it, it takes 3 seconds, and then you're ready to go with it. So, yeah, I'm like, I think I forgot something. What did I forget? Yeah, the way to turn on the modulation. So that's a big one.
You have to download?
No, but you have to enable it. It's downloaded when you install it. It's almost weird that it's not enabled because it's clear how they want you to use mixing from now on. Like, but they still make you enable it once. So.
Just to check if you're like really thinking about it.
What's that?
Just to check if you're really thinking about it.
I guess so, right? But, all right. So, look, we'll talk a bit more about the final. We'll talk about the final project next week. But what I'm going to ask that you do for this week is in a map of your own, any map. You could just be a sandbox. I want you to recreate something like I just did. I have at least 3 audio sources that you can control the volume of, route them to a single destination, and change the mix based on user input or triggers. That's fine. That's totally fine. It can be sound, doesn't have to be music. But you can see how it once you understand mixing, you start to understand adaptive music as well. There's the other method, by the way, for doing adaptive music is branching, right? So this is like layering stuff, and then you mute and unmute. The other part is like, well, okay, I don't want this piece of music at all whatsoever. I want another piece. That would just be branching. But branching for us means that, okay, we'd be turning off all these audio sources, maybe turning on some other audio sources. Where it gets tricky is if there's like, musical transitioning to happen on the bar. We'll see if we have time to get into that this semester or not, but we will talk a little bit about the timing system called the Quartz timing system, which is what really allows you to do that. All right, well, if there are no more questions, thank you for your attention. Really appreciate it. I know it's a confusing topic, so bear with me. I'll upload this. If you don't see it, let me know right away. I'll try to upload it by tomorrow, so if you have time to do it and to go through it. I'll update the blueprint. No, the Brightspace as well to reflect this assignment. And after that, we'll talk about the final project next week, where again, I'll be asking you to essentially implement all these techniques from the semester in the same map with an emphasis on sound design. So, take care, everyone. Thank you so much. Enjoy the beautiful day.